well, they're not subterranean, but, subsurface realms, and that, helps them. There are specific admixtures that they add to ayahuasca so that they can travel in these areas and talk to the mermaids or whatever entities present themselves as mermaids. So it's very much part of the mythology. And I don't know, in my own experiences with ayahuasca, I very often have had the feeling of being, one of the aspects of the experience for me is this feeling of being in a subterranean marine environment of some kind, that very often comes up for me. So that's about all I can tell you about it. It actually, there's a very interesting movie, film that was made by a group of anthropologists, I think at Florida State University or Florida. Anyway, one of the universities in Florida that has a pretty strong anthropology program. And the name of the movie is called The Trees Have a Mother. And it's a very interesting documentary. It was filmed in Iquitos, and it's the story of this one woman whose son was abducted, whose son got lost in the forest. And when that happens down there, they often say that they have been taken by the Chuyachakwi. And the Chuyachakwi is one of these mythical characters, that again appears to people in remote areas of the jungle and will entice them to follow them and then abduct them. And the Chuyachakwi is this forest spirit, not entirely bad, but not entirely good. And the way you can tell if you're dealing with a Chuyachakwi is that they look just like an ordinary person, except their feet are put on backwards, right? So that's part of their trick. You think they're following, they're going away, and you think they're going the opposite direction. But if you Google that movie, it will come up. There are parts of it that are online, and I think it's very interesting as a kind of gives you a good insight into kind of the mythology of contemporary Iquitos, contemporary mestizo belief systems.
Well, the interactions between the water world and the plant world are obvious. I wasn't aware of the dolphin connection, but one of the things that did happen when we made this offering is all these porpoises appeared out of nowhere, which I thought was interesting.
Right. And when I say the dolphins, there are pink dolphins. They're freshwater dolphins in the Amazon. Yes. So that's what we're talking about, not the ocean dolphins.
Right.
But okay. Same thing. So there are long passages in that movie that talk about this underwater world and many crazy stories. It's well worth a look if you can locate it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dennis.
Sure.
We are speaking with Dennis McKenna. Please support him by visiting him at hefter.org. That's HEFFTER.org, where you can learn more about his work. Our next section is Mind Matters, and M. Sanchez has the first question.
Hello, Dennis. This is M. Sanchez.
Hello.
And my question is, can you elaborate on how schizophrenia and similar disorders could be an initiation process towards a higher state of experience? I've read a few articles online that links schizophrenia with shamanism, and I'd like to hear what your thoughts on that would be.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you're familiar with the work of Viliad, who was one of the classical sort of early writers on shamanism, he's famous for his work, Shamanism, the Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, which came out about 1958, I think. and in some ways it's very outdated, but it's still a classic in the field. And he points out that, there are similarities between schizophrenia and shamanism, and that both are altered states. And the schizophrenic, the difference is that as Eliade says, the shaman is not simply a madman. The shaman is a healed madman. And that's the key difference. That's often that's often why people become shamans in these traditional societies, because they're different. They have spontaneously or genetically, or because they're schizophrenic, they have access to altered states that most people don't experience. There's no real category in these traditional societies that says that corresponds to schizophrenia. This is a creation of modern psychiatry. This is a categorization of modern psychiatry, and in some ways it's not accurate. I completed a 3-year study a little while ago. There was just a paper published about it, but I completed a study in the Amazon looking for plants that might be used to treat schizophrenia. And it's very interesting talking to traditional healers about this, because you say, so what do you use to treat schizophrenia? And most of them say, well, what's schizophrenia, right? They don't really recognize that. They recognize that there are, that there are aberrant states of mind. They recognize that there is mental illness. They don't categorize it the same way. One I talked to, a well-known healer who has kind of half of he has some familiarity with Western medicine. I asked him, and he said, well, it depends. He said, some kinds of schizophrenia, you hear voices, right? And you use this plant to treat that kind of schizophrenia. And my ears perked up, because I thought, aha, here's, this actually maps to Western diagnostic categories. So you hear voices. That's great. That's one of the hallmarks of schizophrenia. But then he said, but then there's another kind where you've been enchanted by the dolphins, right? And then you use a whole different set of plants to treat that kind of schizophrenia. So the categories, you can't map these traditional categories of mental illness onto our psychiatric categories. There's the phenomenon of Asperger's syndrome and autism and all that, which isn't exactly schizophrenia, but there are similarities. And many Asperger people they're savants. They can be very high functioning, and yet they don't think the way that you or I might think, but they can, they can be stigmatized as mentally ill. And in some ways I don't approve of the labels, because to put a label on someone is to, in a sense, to set them apart, and it doesn't recognize what might be good about their condition. We all need to think different in Steve Jobs' words. So, well, I kind of lost my thread here. I guess what I was trying to say is that schizophrenia is one way of looking at it. Shamanism can be one way of dealing with your schizophrenia in some ways. If you have schizophrenia, or if you have spontaneously altered states of consciousness, you can approach that through medication. You can take antipsychotic drugs. You can essentially give yourself over to the mercies of the psychopharmaceutical industrial complex, biomedical treatment, and you will get treated using the best tools that we have in biomedicine to treat those things, which are basically at this point the so-called atypical antipsychotic drugs. Or you can take another approach, and you can actually try to approach dealing with these states as a kind of a gift in some ways. You can utilize these states as they give you access to a realm that most people don't have. It's the use you make of these things that makes the difference, I think. Which is not to say, schizophrenia is not fun it's not fun. It's something that people have to deal with. Unlike psychedelics, which can be fun. I guess the difference is, psychedelic, the state goes away eventually. You're not always in that state. And schizophrenics, like the early stages of schizophrenia can be somewhat like a psychedelic state, but then that doesn't last. And it grades over into some pretty, dysphoric states, which most people don't enjoy. Did that address your question, or did I get?
Yeah, that actually addressed a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I agree with a lot what you're saying, since that's how I view schizophrenia and other mental diseases. They're gifts. They're almost like tests. If you can pass them, then you get into a higher state of I'll say experience. You just see things differently than other people, so you can help others.
Right.
Which is what I read with some articles about shamanism and schizophrenia together. And,
yeah, I think, there's even a chapter in The Invisible Landscape about shamanism and schizophrenia. The Invisible Landscape was written 30 years ago, so it's kind of out of date too, but the reason that the shaman is good has these skills, to address people's what you might call spiritual illnesses is because they've been there. They know how to travel in this territory. And although they apply a completely different model to it, they say, well, the illness is due to loss of soul. And the job of the shaman is very often to go get the soul and bring it back and restore it to the person and thus restore wholeness. So that's not exactly a biomedical model, but in the case of these mental illnesses, I hesitate to use the word illnesses, but in these profoundly altered mental states, it's not so much how you label it, it's whatever works, and for some people who have schizophrenia, maybe they need antipsychotic drugs, maybe they need psychotherapy. In other cases, maybe what they need is a shaman, who can take them through that process. And maybe they need to become shamans, that's another approach.
all right. Thank you for that. I actually have a follow-up question to what you were talking about.
Okay.
What is the prevalence of mental illness among the native populations that you know? By mental illness, the most common in the U.S. are depression, bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, anxiety, including PTSD and OCD, as well as growing incidence of autism.
Yeah, there's just not data on it. There's just no statistics, because of the fact that they do view these things differently. They don't apply those categories, so it's very hard to make any comparison. Besides which, the data just isn't there. They're not keeping data. There's a folk disease, if you want to call it that, a folk disorder known as susto that is pretty common in the Amazon, and it's kind of like anxiety disorder. It's recognized the person is subject to panic attacks. The person may feel, a lot of anxiety and a lot of panic and feel under threat, and might be depressed as well, and